Well, hello. It's nice to be here in Southampton. I left home this morning. It was teeming down with rain, so I'm sure it's always a lot brighter down here. Like Sarah, I wasn't too sure who or how many we'd have in the room and what your experience around social care and social care research would be. So I've tried to put together a presentation that encompasses a range of things, and hopefully some, if not all of it, you'll find interesting. Some of it you'll find okay, and some of it, hopefully not too much, you'll find a little bit tedious if you already know too much about social care. Ah, great, thank you. We have the Q&A part at the end, but I've been given an hour, which seems an awfully long time. I've never been given an hour before. I don't know what they're expecting. So we have an hour for me to talk and then a Q&A, but please do chip in along the way if you have any questions. It gives me a chance to have a drink of water and just refresh myself. Okay? So, now which key? There we go. So yes, I'm going to try and move out of your way a little bit, which is really going to annoy the cameraman because I'm going to keep doing this. Sorry. Oh no, that will go out now on the website. I shall try and stop. So, yes, I'm going to do a presentation in three overlapping areas. I'm going to talk about the NIHR School for Social Care Research, where, as Sarah said, I am the research program manager. I'm going to talk about adult social care in England. Each word of that is significant. And I'm going to talk a bit about social care in terms of how it's organised, because I'm not sure how familiar people are with how social care is organised. Often I end up talking to a room full of people that are more NHS focused and they don't really understand the world of social care. So I'll talk a bit about how social care is organised, but also a bit about, within that, some of the implications for research, trying to do research in social care. And then I'm going to talk lastly about adult social care research and links into the NIHR. I'm not going to talk specifically about particular funding streams like RFPB or HTA or HSDR because colleagues from the RDS are going to cover that, and they know in far better detail than I do about the minutiae of each of those funding streams. But I'm going to talk just generally about NIHR and social care research. So does that feel okay as a start? Yeah? Okay, nobody wants to leave at this point? Okay, done 5 minutes and you're still with me. So, about the School for Social Care Research, we have a mission that was given to us by the NIHR, who fund us, and that is to develop the evidence base for adult social care practice in England by commissioning and conducting world-class research. So you'll recognise some of the phrases there if you are familiar with NIHR, notably world-class research. So trying to do leading-edge research. And we are one of 3 schools now in NIHR. So the School for Primary Care and Research was established first, and then the School for Public Health Research came along just after us. And although the remit of each of the schools is similar in terms of trying to increase the evidence base for their areas of interest, we all operate slightly differently. So I'll talk about the School for Social Care Research, but please don't take that as being each of the other 2 schools operates exactly the same. So we were established in 2009 with a 5-year contract and a budget of £15 million, and we had the core institutions of LSE, where the administrative hub of the school sits, King's College London, and the universities of Kent, Manchester and York. And during that first 5 years, we undertook around 70 primary research projects, ranging from smaller scoping projects through to some larger studies that encompassed aspects of trying to develop interventions, for instance. And we commissioned 28 methods and scoping reviews. I'll talk a little bit more about the methods reviews in a moment. The scoping reviews was that kind of that ministerial response to unknown issues. Well, we don't really know what to do about it. We'll commission some research on it. So that there were topics that we didn't really know what research we'd want to commission. So we commissioned some scoping papers to help us understand better the landscape and try to identify what the questions might be. So there are scoping reviews on care home managers. Who are they? What's their background? that kind of thing. Advocacy, trying to help us understand advocacy a little bit more. And then NIHR decided that we were doing okay and they'd renew us, and there was another open call for universities to apply to be part of the second phase. Hello. And so from 2009, 2014 to, we'll be running in this phase to 2019, and with the same budget, £15 million, but with a slightly different configuration of universities. So King's College London dropped out of the school this time, and the University of Bristol came in. And we think in this phase we will have around 45 research projects. So we have the same budget and more or less the same configuration. The thing that's different is that we have generally larger research projects this time. Some of that is just increases in costs that go with inflation over time. Some of it is actually, I think, people are developing slightly bigger ambitions and understanding in terms of putting together their research projects. So we have 45 projects that are live at the moment. So in phase one, some examples of the research that we commissioned and undertook. So we had a whole clutch of research that was around different client groups and different needs, cutting across mental health, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, focusing on not so much on particular needs, but on other aspects of people, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. So we've tried to be very, very broad and encompassing in the kind of client groups and needs that we've been interested in. And an example that we had of a project was men who live with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So these young men are living with muscular dystrophy and their muscles are wasting away. And the project was particularly looking at their interactions with social care, and one of the findings from it was that the issue of their sexuality never came up. So these were young men, they had similar interests to young men around sexuality, but no services ever asked them about this, and it was a really, for many of them, it was a really unfulfilled part of their lives. So that's an example of one of the things that we've been able to highlight. Care settings, so a whole range of research that's around different care settings. Care homes are perhaps one of the most obvious parts of social care, but also research with and in communities, within people's homes, domiciliary care, home care. Looking at alternative models of accommodation. So there's the shared lives model. Have people come across this? Yeah, where people can sign up and say, I will share my home with other people that need somewhere to stay for a while. So you may be offering a kind of respite break for somebody, or an opportunity for somebody with mental health problems who needs to have a change of environment to go and live with somebody else for a while. So they share their accommodation, share their lives with that person that has some kind of social care need. Now, it's a very new model, and we have projects underway and previous projects that have started to evaluate that model of service. And also, social care is characterised by a huge amount of diversity, particularly in terms of providers. So providers, there's relatively little in the way of state-provided social care now, maybe state-funded, but not state-provided. And so providers are often in the private sector or in third sector. So we've had projects that span across that. And an illustrative project around different thinking about care settings is the Connecting People study, which is colleague Martin Webber up at York. And this is around trying to work with social workers around a model of developing social capital. So how can social workers work better with their clients who've got mental health problems to connect them better into communities and into social capital, social networks? And then we've had a whole range of projects that are about practice and practice policy into practice issues. So we are focused on practice. There are other funding streams that look at research around social care policy, but obviously there's not a neat divide between the two. So one of the things we have looked at is how do issues of policy get translated into practice? So you probably know about personal budgets. Safeguarding is the policy around how to help people be safe and secure. And one of the projects we've had was his name's gone out of my head. John Woolham at King's College London now was looking at personal budgets and support for older people. So how well is this process of personal budgets, whereby local authorities say, okay, you've been deemed as eligible for state-funded support. Now you've been allocated this budget. Now we're going to agree with you how you're going to spend that budget, rather than saying, okay, you're eligible, here's the services that you can now go to. You have a budget to spend. And so John was looking at how well that was working in terms of older people, which is one of the controversial areas of personal budgets. They may work, the argument went, they may work quite well for younger adults that have got physical disabilities, but how well will they work for fragile older people? And what he found was some people that use personal budgets that are older people, it works well for. It's often questionable as to how much choice they actually have in what they can spend it on. But overall, he didn't find that there was a huge increase in some of their aspects of their well-being by using a personal budget. So now we're into phase 2, and we have a whole series of continuing themes from phase 1. Carers has been quite a big focus of interest for us. So looking at carers and employment. So a lot of people in employment start to become carers. The caring role gradually takes over and they tip out of employment because they can't juggle everything. But this project by Linda Pickard and colleagues at LSE is looking at some models whereby employers try to help people stay in employment and manage the caring role. Mary Larkin is doing a project on scoping out what is the knowledge that we already have around how to support carers, and then working with Sky at the moment in trying to make that into an online resource. Various work with different client groups and needs groups. So mental illness and learning disabilities have both continued as strong themes in this phase. So looking at, again, around community connections, how can you work with people with mental health problems, anxiety and depression in this case, to connect them with communities and address issues of loneliness. And another project by Frank Keating is looking at recovery amongst African and Caribbean men with mental health problems. And then in learning disabilities, fathers with learning disabilities and their experience of adult social care service, so a relatively new area. I think it's one of the things we've been able to do quite well is to identify some more niche areas like men with muscular dystrophy or fathers who've got learning disabilities, and projects that probably, because they're quite niche, probably wouldn't have been of a huge interest to some other funders. We've been able to support those projects to start to unearth what it's like for their lives. And another one is forced marriage of adults with learning disabilities. So this is a live project looking at the experience of women with learning disabilities who are being forced into marriages. But in phase 2, we've got a whole new series of themes and future challenges in our research. So prevention. Prevention has become much more of a topic for social care. And so we are trying to help in that. Social care is trying to grapple with understanding what prevention responsibility means. And a project by Jose Luis Fernandez and colleagues at LSE is looking at how do you work with local authorities to help them develop a framework to understand the impact of their prevention work. Similarly, social care now has a responsibility or some responsibilities towards offenders. We have a project on social care in prisons. With all of the changes in how social care has been organised, there's new changes in the workforce, new workforce emerging. So if somebody has a personal budget, they can directly employ themselves a personal assistant. So it's a completely unregulated aspect of care, and the models for the employment may differ, but this is a new kind of workforce that's emerging. And so we have a project that's looking at specifically workplace personal assistance for physically disabled people. But that's a whole huge interesting area around personal assistance. Self-funders, these are people who aren't eligible for state-funded social care, but who decide to buy some care for themselves. So that may be anything from paying for somebody to come into their home a few hours a day to help them with some activities of daily living, right through to paying for care home placements. But it's a growing area, but it's not one that we know an awful lot about. How do these self-funders navigate the system? What information do they need? And then what are their experiences of working through the system? Future demands. So we have some projects that are trying to look at, well, okay, what are the future demands on adult social care and how can these best be managed? So this notion of optimal time, everyone agrees there's no optimal time for somebody with dementia to move into a care home. But this is a project that's trying to look at, can we have a better sense of when is a better or worse time for somebody in those circumstances to move? And we have a project that's trying to look at, can you identify unmet social care needs and then link those with well-being? So if you have needs that are deemed eligible for state-funded care, does that lead to a better outcome for your well-being than if you are deemed as having needs but not being eligible for state-funded care? What are the consequences for your well-being? Which could play interestingly into the kind of prevention agenda, I guess. And we're looking at future challenges and opportunities and future, we are hopeful that there'll be a third phase of the school. NIHR are being quite encouraging, but we don't know for certain. And so we're trying to look at, so what is the future of social care beyond 2019? And the idea is that we can start to lay down some foundations for work from 2019 onwards for whatever constitutes the next phase of the school. I mentioned methods papers. So one of the things that has concerned us is that I think a lot of social care research tends to take a relatively narrow range of research methods, largely qualitative, case study kind of approaches. That's all good stuff, but is a narrow range of methods when there's this huge range of methods out there, as we know. And so what we've tried to do is to commission people to write about certain aspects of methods and make those available on our website so that people that are interested in social care research but perhaps only know about certain methods can start to read about a wider range of these methods and start to think about how they might be incorporated into their research projects. So Anne Bowling has published about quality of life measures. What are good measures? How might they work in social care? Woods and Russell have written about randomisation and chance-based designs in social care research. So this is largely a paper about randomised control trials. But the sense is that there's been a huge controversy about randomised control trials in social care research, with various people arguing that they're inappropriate, unethical, and other kinds of arguments. So we commissioned this paper, and they tried to avoid using the phrase randomised control trial in the title so as not to put people off. How do you think randomisation and chance-based designs works as a better title? Does it? Oh, okay. Doesn't quite grab you? No? Okay. But hopefully you don't get any antibodies to the title, which is what they were worried about with RCTs. Michaela Tinelli has looked at applying discrete choice experiment in social care research. So this is a method largely derived from economics around how do you look at people's range of choices and then how they would come up with a set of preferences within those choices. Douglas McKelvey has looked at modelling social care complexity by using an approach called system dynamics, which looks at models of stock and flow. So a hospital would be a good example of where this has been applied. Looking at the flow of people into and through the hospital and trying to model that. And Douglas has tried to apply those models, those approaches to modelling aspects of social care. And the idea is once you've got your model, you can work with different parameters so that you can start saying, well, okay, if we change this aspect of the system, the service, what would that have an impact on in terms of our flow of people and where might we experience bottlenecks and so on. So it's an interesting approach. We've also got a paper that's looking at the MRC framework for evaluating complex interventions. Do people know about that? Yeah. So we have this paper that's looking at how well that might be applied in social care generally, but more specifically in the context of end-of-life care. So how would those principles work in trying to do research, develop a research program around end-of-life care? We have a project that's looked at methods paper that's looked at inclusive methods in learning disabilities. So how do you include people with learning disabilities in your research? And we've got a paper that's generally talking about the challenges of researching in care homes and what methods might and might not work in care homes. Deborah Rutter has written about doing systematic reviews in social care. Hussein has done one on trying to use large-scale data sets. So one of the things that we have tried to encourage is for people to look at what are existing data sets in existing large-scale data sets that might have some relevance to answering questions in social care. So, for instance, there is some administrative social care data, what use might be made of that or what better use might be made of it. But then you've got large cohort studies like ELSA, for instance, and what might you do in terms of using some of the data in there to help answer issues of interest to social care. So the project I mentioned earlier around trying to look at unmet need and well-being is using ELSA data, English Longitudinal Study of Aging data, as part of its data sets to help answer that question. And Vickers et al. Have written about including people from black and minority backgrounds in research. Goodman has another paper about researching in end-of-life care. Alce Young has written about research with D-deaf people, so the lower and uppercase D designate the person with deafness and part of a deaf community, I think it is. So it's a really interesting paper. I'm fascinating just learning about that whole community, that whole group of people and their experiences, let alone then how you would go about researching in those settings. Derek King and Raphael Wittenberg have tried to map out, I talked about these data sets. Derek and Raphael have tried to map out what are the existing data sets. So their report says, well, there's ELSA, there's various other data sets out there. This is what's in them. This is how you get access to them. So hopefully that's available to yourselves as researchers now to start to look through that and say, okay, we could use this data set to help us answer this question. And Netten has written about outcome measures in adult social care. We've got one looking at applying mathematical modelling. And Jim Mansell wrote about structured observational research in services for people who learn disabilities. So how can you be an observer in a service that's there for people who learn disabilities? So specifically about learning disabilities, but some of the issues are obviously a bit more general to that. So if you're interested in observational methods, that might be a paper still of interest, even though it's about learning disabilities. So what we wanted to do was, as I said, to encourage people to think about a whole range of different resources and research methods to help answer social care questions. Other activities, we have an annual conference. The next one is on the 12th of April. You could probably still register for it if you're interested. So this will be at LSE. It'll be free to attend, and it's a whole day program of keynote speakers plus presentations from various of our projects. So it's a good day. It's free if you can get there. And unfortunately, I can't make it this year. So I'm going on holiday. So I'm not welcome at work at the moment. I'm really sorry to have to miss it. I am. Does that come across as sincere? Because this is going to be on the website. So we do a range of activities, workshops and events. We are launching a Journal of Long-Term Care. We've had a soft launch of it. It exists, but in that we are calling for papers. So if you are in the process of writing papers about long-term care is more of an international term for social care. That's why we've gone for long-term care. But if you have papers arising from your studies at the moment and you're looking to publish it, please do contact me and we can consider it for the Journal of Long-Term Care, which a little bit later this year we'll have a website and we'll get the flow of articles going through. I mentioned the Capacity Development Awards. We work with policy colleagues about trying to create more of an evidence-aware environment generally around social care. And we are having discussions with NIHR around supporting adult social care research more. So that's the school. Did people, I should have asked this at the start, shouldn't I? Did people know about the school? No? Yeah? Mixed, yeah? Okay. Did people know about all the different things that we've done and the activities and the methods papers and so on? Yeah? Okay, so I haven't just talked to a room full of people that already knew what I was talking about. I should have asked at the start, sorry. Okay, any questions about the school? Hopefully I've addressed the first question, which is, do you have any money? No, we don't at the moment. Okay, I'll move on then. Having talked so much about social care, I probably ought to try and characterise it a little bit. So social care is really hard to define. It has so many fuzzy boundaries overlapping with health and communities and public health and all kinds of areas. So there's not a neat definition of this is social care. But what's clear is that it's not synonymous with social work. Many people think that that's all that social care is, and it's not. And then from a research point of view, it's not synonymous with social science. Often those two get conflated as well, and people say, oh, social care, that's social science research, and it's not the same. So as I mentioned, we at SSCR cover adult social care, reflecting that administrative split at the level of departments that I mentioned. We've tried to be flexible around that. So if people have come to us with projects, and we recognise that administrative splits don't map neatly into people's lives, but if they want to do a project that is about maybe families in which there are children in receipt of social care and adults in receipt of social care, and the research is about all of them as a family, then we've tried to be flexible and consider that as a legitimate project for us. And also if people are looking at transition issues from children's and young adult services through to adult services, we've commissioned research that relates to that, for instance. So colleagues at York have done a project around, it's called something like Taking On, Taking Over. So if young people and their family have a personal budget for the social care support for that young person, and as they move into adulthood, what's the experience of taking over control of that budget themselves? So we've tried to be flexible, but there is that divide there for us. In terms of NIHR generally and the NHS, I'm not really sure how that would work out in detail for if you wanted to apply to NIHR to do a research project that was about children's social care. I really don't know how different parts of NIHR would understand that in terms of their remits. I think if you could relate it to NHS and children's social care, they'd probably go, okay, that seems okay. But if it was purely about social care for children, I really don't know how they would respond. So we understand social care in a very broad and inclusive way. I've talked about the range of care and support needs that people have: mental health, learning disabilities, older people, physical disabilities, etc. We try to understand the whole range of services that are available, home care, care homes, etc. And the range of service providers. I've talked about third sector and independent for-profit organisations. We've also been very interested and concerned about informal care, family carers. There's a whole range of terms that are used for carers, family carers, informal carers. I'm not sure I can ever find the right one to settle on for the right audience. But that's largely what I mean, families and friends that help care and support people. And we've been interested in self-funders, as I say, as a growing area of the sector, and interestingly links into communities, which I think is becoming a bigger aspect of understanding of social care. How can social care link into communities, community resources? Community assets is one of the buzz phrases at the moment. So you can see it really is big and diverse, and has many, many fuzzy boundaries in all of those there, not only overlapping with NHS and formal services there, but also with public health, issues of community development and so on. So I think one of the challenges for social care and social care research is it can be so difficult to pin down that it's almost seen as it's just an adjunct to something else, an adjunct to hospitals or primary care. And obviously that in terms of people's lives is an aspect. It does overlap with those often. But it is a sector in its own right, and it has its own perspective on things. Social care is not the same perspective as healthcare always. And I think one of the issues is sometimes there may be projects that are about coming from a health perspective, looking at aspects of social care, but from a health perspective, and not necessarily looking at social care in its own right, its own entity, maybe just as an adjunct to hospitals, getting people out of hospital, for instance, or just as an adjunct to how does social care help to deal with this person's diagnosis and symptoms, etc., rather than a social care perspective might be about how can you better support that person living with that condition to be connected into their communities, for instance. So it has, although it overlaps with all these areas, particularly across the NHS, it is a sector in its own right with its own perspective. So the sector is very diverse in terms of needs. You know, I've talked about a whole range of people's needs: physical disabilities, learning disabilities, mental health, etc. Plus then there's their family, and unpaid carers is another phrase that's used. Most significantly different to the NHS is it is not a universal service. It is not necessarily free to everyone at the point of provision. It makes for a huge difference compared to the NHS. So there's a means test. There's an eligibility test. Do you meet the threshold for eligibility of need? Are your needs high enough? And that's been creeping up. And then if you do that, then you'll be means tested. What level of assets do you have? And do we need to take those into account before you're eligible for state-funded social care support? If you don't meet the eligibility needs, but you have some kind of need, and or you don't meet the means-tested test, then you don't get state-funded support, which is the difference to the NHS, and then you're thrown onto your own resources, trying to cope, trying to spend out of pocket to buy the support, pay for the care home, pay for someone to come round to your house, until maybe then you drop down to meet the eligibility in terms of, say, means tested. So does anybody know what the level of assets is at the moment for eligibility? 23,000. Not a lot, is it? If you've got £23,000 of assets, you're going to have to pay for your own social care until you drop down to 23,000. I think this is often quite a shock to people that don't know social care. They have this idea that it's kind of similar to the NHS, and if I go and see the GP, he'll kind of put me in touch with a social worker, and then all these nice people will start coming around to my house and start helping me out in the way that maybe district nurses and others do. But it's just completely different. So yeah, that makes a huge difference to how social care is administered and organised compared to the NHS, and makes a difference to then how you research this sector. It can be quite a bit harder in trying to identify and recruit samples of participants, particularly if you're interested in this area of self-funders, which, as I say, is a growing area. People are much more interested and concerned about this group of people. But how on earth do you find self-funders if they're navigating their own way around the market for provision, and then you say, well, I'm interested in doing some research around self-funders? How do you find that sample of people? I've talked about a range of care settings and care types, so care homes and people's homes. Day services, there's probably much less in the way of provision of day centres now. They're kind of model that went out of vogue, and then with austerity, I think more and more have been cut. But there are still some there. Community-based teams, and as I say, much more interest now in working with communities. One of the other huge differences compared to the NHS is that social care operates through a national policy framework and legislation, which is then devolved down to local authorities with responsibility for social care, for them to implement that in the ways that they see fit. So there's a lot of devolution down to individual local authorities in terms of how they want to operate their social care services. And essentially you can end up with 152 different social care systems, which, you know, as a member of the public trying to navigate that, well, you probably only got to learn about one of them, and you might just about work your way around that eventually. But as a researcher, you know, if you're interested in which of these 152 are you interested in going to research, how are you going to get access to each one, and what aspects of them are you interested in researching? And just because they say they've got similar kinds of services, actually the detail of how they operate can be very, very different, because the local responsibility, they've used that to create services that are labelled the same, but they decide they're going to operate very differently. And do people know about reablement services? So the idea of reablement services is to try to avoid building dependency with people. So there'll be a mixture of people in the services, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, social workers, and they may do a whole range of different things around therapy or around home adaptations and so on. And the idea is that, say, if somebody's being discharged from the hospital, the reablement service may work with them to help to get them settled back in home, help to get them more able to live independently, do activities of daily living, focus on specific skills, help them develop or relearn those skills, but for a short period of time, and then withdraw from working with that person in the hope that then they don't need services any longer. So there's research that looks at reablement services and says they're effective and cost effective, and then it went into national policy, and then every local authority developed its own version of a reablement service, and they'll vary in everything that you can think of with reablement services. So who's in the service, who they work with, how long they work with them for, what they do for them and with them, whether they discharge people early. Some say we work for 8 weeks and they're going to get 8 weeks. Some will say, well, if at the end of 4 weeks it's clear they're okay, we'll discharge them. Every single aspect that you can imagine, I think, is completely different across reablement services. So if you're interested in researching reablement services, you've got to find them across these 152. You've got to try and get access to them, and then you've got to try and find out whether they're in any sense comparable or not. The sector is big. Around 1.5 million social care jobs, but it's not very professionalised. Most of those people working in the sector are in kind of care assistant sort of roles, so not highly professionally qualified, Social workers are the main profession in there, but there's occupational therapists and physiotherapists and some nurses working in social care. But in the main, it's a not professionally qualified sector, and again that can have implications then for research. So they're not. A lot of the workforce, even a lot of the professionally qualified workforce in the sector, are not research aware, very research naive sector. And so if you're interested in trying to gain access to people that work in the sector to do research with, then you might have a challenge in trying to find them and work out who they are and where they are, but then in trying to engage them in understanding what is this thing research, why is it important, why should I bother? And then on top of that, you may well get access to somewhere like a care home, say, and start collecting data with the workforce. But the turnover of staff in care homes is about 19% a year. And in home care, it's about 25%. Where they can find home care workers these days, it's a struggle in lots of places. You probably saw in the news, was it Panorama did a report just this week, where they said that there's been about 100 contracts handed back to local authorities for home care because the providers have said we just can't do it any longer. We can't find the staff to work it. We can't run a service at the level of fees you're prepared to pay. And it's the national living wage is part of the sector now, but you can still probably earn more working in certain supermarkets. So you may get access to some of these services and think you're in the door and you start to work with staff to collect data, and then find that over the year 25% of the staff have just gone and changed, and the service may have even folded. I'm not joking there. We have commissioned projects, that external projects. They have applied to us to do funding on the basis of a certain scenario about some services. And by the time we've gone through peer review and commissioning and contracting, the researchers gone, great, we've got this grant now. Oh no, the services have gone. The local authorities have just pulled the funding on all the services they were going to research. So we've had to sit down with the researchers then and work out, what can sensibly, because the contracts have been signed then, what can sensibly be done here now. So you're talking about a very volatile situation for trying to do research in. What was the alternative? I can't remember the details now. I think I've tried to put it out of my mind. It was so painful. They continued to look at the same area, which was around advocacy, and we agreed that they'd look at the perspective slightly differently to what they were looking at was kind of the continuity of, ironically, the continuity of advocacy services. And we agreed that they could look at a slightly different perspective on advocacy services. So the sector is big in terms of the resources that are there. So care homes now have about 3 to 4 times the number of beds that there are in the NHS. Did people know that? Shocking, isn't it? Absolutely amazing. So yeah, around 3 to 4 times more beds in care homes than in the NHS. We always think of the NHS and is the big provider of beds, and it's terrible when the people are taking up beds when they should be out and so on. But there's more beds in social care. And of course, what we've seen is a significant shift in how we as a society support certain people, particularly older, fragile people that in the past may have been on a ward. They used to call them the back wards, was it? The back wards in hospital. And we've seen a complete shift now, and the idea of a care home that provided nursing care would have really been some working with people that had quite low levels of nursing care needs. But they've now been moved out of the hospitals and into communities, and through communities into care homes. And now care homes deal with people with very high levels of dependency of need now, and usually comorbidities, dementia, physical problems, and so on. So we've actually increased the number of beds in the care home sector, but we've also increased the sort of acuity of the people in those beds now. Care homes is a more generic term. Nursing care homes are the higher level dependency with nursing staff on duty, and then residential care is the step down from that, where they don't necessarily have nurses on duty all the time, but they're still providing, again, still quite high levels of care and support for people. But it's a very fluid distinction, and some care homes are residential homes and vice versa, and some individual beds in the homes may move between the two as well. So it's quite a fluid concept.
Working. Okay. My question sort of relates to the ladies next to me. The 474 beds, I'm assuming, is a combination of residential and nursing care homes, and it does not include people receiving social care in their own homes, but with a lot of
That's
assistance.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, those are, if you like, institutional beds, not in people's homes. Yeah. So demographic and social changes are really hitting the sector quite hard already. They're seeing an increase in demand from, we hear a lot about the ageing population, the shifting demographic of more people living longer, and then many of those people living with comorbidities and increasing levels of dependency. And that will feed through into social care in terms of then more demand for support and care home beds and so on. We don't hear quite so much about this issue of more younger people with disabilities who are living into adulthood but who need quite a range of social care support, and often very complex packages of care and support, and thereby often very expensive ones. And you talk to some local authorities and they say that this second group, the younger people living through, is actually more of a pressure on resources than the ageing population is. We don't hear quite so much about that, but it is a huge issue in social care. And social care is getting more interested in issues of loneliness and isolation amongst older people particularly, and then the consequences for the older people, but also the consequences for services. So state funding, gross spending by local authorities on social care for older people fell by 9% in real terms between 2009 to 15. So during broadly the life of the coalition government, spending on adult social care nationally fell by 9%. The pattern within individual local authorities varied significantly. Some increased spending on social care, but the average was about a 9% drop. And that was, believe it or not, local authorities largely protecting social care. Local authorities had a drop in their budgets of around a third from their central government grants over that period, and some of them decided that other parts of their services, like libraries, museums, for instance, would take the brunt of the cuts, and they would try to protect social care. So over the life of the coalition government, I don't think we heard a huge amount about the difficulties that social care was experiencing. There was a certain element of protectiveness going on, and a certain element of, somebody described to me, he said during that period he thought that social care would just hit a cliff and drop off it. But actually he said what it's been is just a gradual erosion of the service and eligibility and so on. Central government funding to local government is set to fall by 37%, so about another third again between 2010 and 15. So that's the programme for this current government, is to cut local government funding by about 37%. Most local authorities are saying they can no longer protect social care in that kind of regime, and that some, as I mentioned earlier, some directors of social services I speak to say beyond 2020 they cannot see a future for state-funded adult social care. In the budget there was an extra few billion given to social care, you may remember, over the next few years, but they're saying that won't even help them to stand still, is what a lot of local authorities are saying. And again, thinking about it in terms of a research angle, it's obviously a huge research question as to how local authorities are coping and what's happening to people that maybe now aren't eligible for support that they used to get. But in terms of then getting access to local authorities or other providers to research what's happening, it's just a huge distraction, if not burden, on people working in the sector. If you go along and say, right, we now want to do all this research and collect data from you, you're just really going to struggle. I mean, we've commissioned projects, and they've said to local authorities, we want to get this data from you out of your administrative data set, and we'll pay you a nominal fee of, I think it was around £1,000. We'll pay you about £1,000 to help cover some of the cost of you extracting that. And they've still struggled to find local authorities that would provide them with the data, because they're just saying we just cannot cope with demands of more research. Some local authorities are still really, really supportive of research and are great to get access to. The best way to get access is to form relationships with local authorities over time, turning up on the doorstep, cold calling if you like, and saying, well, we've got this money from NIHR, we want to do research on you now, is really unlikely to get access into large parts of social care. Forming relationships over time is the best way to do it. And as I said, there is now real concern about the viability of the sector. So not only in terms of those aspects of state-funded social care, but one of the ways in which local authorities have coped with the austerity measures so far is to squeeze the fees that they will pay to care homes for beds. So they've frozen how much they will pay for those beds. And the way that some care homes have coped is that those people that are then self-funders have had to pay more. So they've kind of shunted some of the costs of running the home over onto self-funders. So if state tries to squeeze the funding that it will pay care homes any further, and indeed home care is an example I mentioned earlier, providers are saying, no, enough is enough. We just cannot run the care home on that basis anymore. We cannot provide home care on that basis anymore. So there's huge concern about the viability of the sector now. And the King's Fund and Nuffield did a report early last year that looked from, again, over broadly the period of the coalition government, and found that over that time, 26% fewer older people received state-funded social care at the end compared to at the beginning. So 26% fewer older people were now getting state-funded care. What's happening to them, nobody quite knows. So it's all a bit bleak, isn't it? But again, it has implications for trying to do research in that context. You know, where you may have thought, okay, I'm interested in older people and their needs and social care, and I'll go to the local authority and I'll get access to older people. Well, now there's 26% fewer of those older people to try to recruit to your project. And if anything, they're probably going through the self-funders route, and I've already said there's no register of self-funders.
I don't know if this is too specific, but when I put in my research for patient benefit bid, it was in a care home environment, and we budgeted to pay the care home staff. And I did that based on some background research I had done in the literature, but one of the people from the NIHR felt that was a bad precedent to set, and that we shouldn't be paying care home staff to be involved in the research. And I wondered what you thought about that. And then the other thing is, we elected not to pay the residents of the care homes. It was going to be in residential care homes. And the idea with that was slightly different. It wasn't so much from a money point of view, but it was from is it coercive if you offer money to vulnerable people? So I was wondering if you could address those two sort of related but
paying
separate.
staff and paying residents.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't had any work that's paid directly staff or residents to be participants of projects. I mean, I can see the arguments pro and against for both cases. What we have found, though, is that paying the care home is a really good way of encouraging them to be part of the study. Again, fairly modest payments. The colleagues down in Kent are working with a group of care homes, and they found paying the care home just a few £100 as a kind of nominal token, really, of appreciation for their participation can actually have a big difference in whether homes will participate or not. And then Jill Manthorpe often says that just, again, on a bit of a tokenistic level, but it seems to work, it's just showing some appreciation of people's willingness to participate in the time that they'll put into the study. But providing training to the care home. So if you've got people that know about safeguarding, say that, I think that's one that they've done, and saying, okay, you participate in the study and we'll deliver some training on safeguarding to your staff. Or just down to a laminated certificate that they can put up in reception from the university logo on it saying, thank you for participating in the study. And then when the CQC come and inspect, they can point to that as a little bit of evidence to say, look, we're really interested in quality in this care home and we participated in research to help us understand that. So I think before going down the route of paying individuals, I'd look at, can you do things for the institution that will encourage them to participate? It does seem to work quite well. So some policy trends, I'll try and speed up a bit now. There's a I've talked about the long-running trend in the sector towards mixed economies and use of markets. So 70s, 80s, there was much more in the way of state provision. Local authorities would own and run care homes, for instance. And some still do, but by and large, most of the provision now is in markets. That's been a long-running, continuous policy trend, no matter what complexion the government's been. A little more recently, personalisation, choice and control. So trying to make services more personal, give people more choice and control over what services they get, what support they have. And personal budgets is the best example of that. Again, that's been a fairly consistent theme across a number of governments now, as has trying to move people, trying to support people to live in their own home, to live independently, rather than automatically thinking, let's try and move people into care homes or residential care. So try to maximise people's independence. Eligibility has been tightening. It's becoming harder to get access to care. And again, that was happening a little bit before austerity, but really seemed to step up during austerity. Safeguarding is that kind of policy and practice framework around helping people stay safe and protecting them. There's been a general improvement in measurement of outcomes and quality, and there's the ASCOT. Do people know the ASCOT? There's an outcomes toolkit, adult social care outcomes toolkit, ASCOT, and that's much more widely used in social care now and is part of some of the annual returns that local authorities have to do about people's use of social care. So one of the benefits of that is that it can lead you to calculation of a QALY. People know QALYs that are used particularly in health economics to compare the cost effectiveness of interventions. So it's a kind of, can lead you to a social care QALY. Support for carers has been a continuing long-running theme, and certainly carers have been more visible in social care than I think in the NHS, but I wouldn't necessarily say carers have always got the best deal from social care, but they have generally been more visible than in the NHS. I've talked about the rise in self-funders. I mentioned the Care Act 2014. I've mentioned the payment system and the cap that's been deferred, but the Care Act introduced two key new responsibilities, a duty around prevention and a duty to promote well-being. Now, if anybody's got any handy definitions of what either of those two mean, local authorities would really love to hear it. Local authorities are still grappling with this. Those are things that have been enacted. The payment cap has been postponed, but those duties are being enacted in the law now. And I think local authorities are still struggling to really work through what those mean and what the implications are. And so when I've talked to people in local authorities around well-being, they'll say, anything from, gosh, well, that's just what social care does anyway, that's what we do, to, oh my God, that's about everything that the local authority does. And this huge range of views about what this duty to promote well-being really means. And then there's themes that kind of bubble up as if they're novel every time they bubble up, I think. So interfaces between health and social care and addressing complex issues. So, of course, we're back to delayed transfers of care, or bed blocking, as it's sometimes called. That, again, is up there as a huge priority issue after a number of years when it seemed to have died down as an issue. Integration is there as the great panacea, yet again, because it solved everything last time it became a panacea. But integration is there as an issue that people are more interested in. We have devolution, of course, particularly some of the devolution deals going to major conurbations now like Manchester. And, of course, austerity is still a long-running, well, I think we can call it now a long-running policy trend, 6 years of it. So some implications of research. I've touched on these, so I'll skip over most of them. So it is a diverse sector, which can make it challenging to actually frame your research questions. It takes quite a bit of care to frame, well, okay, am I interested in care homes, nursing care, residential care? What aspect of care are you quite interested in? What group of people are you interested in there? What kinds of needs of that group of people in that care home? But the other thing with the diversity is that often you're working across a range of organisations. So care homes, you might be working with something that's owned and run by the manager, through to something that's part of a huge international corporate chain. It may have a dozen beds, it may have several hundred beds, and that's going to imply some implications for your research and resources and methods and so on. But one thing you can guarantee is pretty well none of them will have much of a history of being involved in research. So there's Enrich, which I'll mention later, which has been there to try to help people in care homes to be more prepared to participate in research. But by and large, social care is not very research experienced. Often there can be a large impact of policy changes, more so than the NHS. I think if the government decides that they're going to introduce personal budgets in social care, local authorities will go out and they'll implement it differently, but they'll go out and implement it. And that can suddenly have a huge impact on the context in which you're trying to do your research. If you were looking at how a group of people navigated the system, then all of a sudden, almost overnight, that group of people may have all suddenly switched over to having personal budgets and be navigating the system in a completely different way. And that is more likely to have an impact than in the NHS, I think, which has a lot more stability around the kind of organisations and service ideas and so on. There's a lack of support and intervention costs to do research in social care. So we've mentioned this issue about trying to do research in care homes, but this idea that actually some modest incentives for people to participate as care homes can seem to work. But there are no NHS support costs for social care research. It is not clear that the research networks that are there to help with recruitment and so on, it is not clear to what extent they will or won't get involved in helping to recruit through social care settings. And there is a huge challenge around trying to find the intervention costs. So we have a colleague at the moment in Nottingham who's looking to put together a social care intervention in people's homes. The local authority won't pay for it because they have no money. But it doesn't come under NHS support costs. So he's got this really interesting idea, a lot of willingness to want to do it, and I know from his track record he can put together good research proposals, and he's thinking of looking to parts of NIHR to apply to, but he knows there's no point in him applying until he can address this question of who's going to pay for the intervention. There's generally a strong history and ethos around PPI, or user care and practitioner involvement, as we tend to think of it in SSCR. But it is stronger in some areas like mental health than in others. One of the problems in social care is that there's no great model of the clinical academic, that kind of person in healthcare, be it a nurse, a therapist, or a medic, who straddles both the clinical and the academic world in the splitting their time and their interests. And they're really key people in trying to bridge those two worlds. You don't have that in social care. People either, as I said, that there aren't many, proportionally there's not a huge number of professionalised workers in social care anyway, but generally you either go down a practice route or you hop out fairly early in your career to go and work in a university, and even then you may well just be doing teaching and not actually engaging. So that there really is a big gulf in between research and practice. Routine data, I said that there has been investment in improving data, but there's been much less investment in this than the NHS. And again, a lot of it in terms of administrative data is devolved down to those 152 local authorities, and the kind of data that you'll get is very variable across them. So if you're thinking of doing a research project that says, well, I'm interested in reablement, say, and I'm going to go to 50 of the local authorities and collect data, well, don't think that they're all going to have the data that you're expecting them to have. Don't think they'll all actually want to participate and provide it. And don't think that if you do get it from them, that the quality of it will all be comparable. There's just huge variation in data compared to the NHS. Large-scale surveys, often people that apply to us say, well, we're going to do a survey of all 152 local authorities to find out what they're doing around X. And we've just come to the point of saying, just unless it's absolutely necessary, don't do it. Response rate will be appalling and probably not worth the effort. And the burden that you're imposing on people that are already very burdened in trying to keep the system running is probably just not worth trying to do. So we've generally tried to avoid commissioning large-scale surveys. I've mentioned about the variability in concepts between local authorities, so reablement. Yes, people have reablement services, but they can be so varied. But concepts can vary between the NHS and social care. So Director of Social Services was telling me recently in their conversations with their local NHS, they started talking about, wouldn't it be good to be doing more in communities? And the NHS and the local authority were sitting there all nodding, going, yes, this is great, we're all agreed, we've signed up. This was all part of the the STP, Sustainability and Transformation process, the plans that they put together. And they're all sitting around, and then gradually they realised they were talking about completely different things. The NHS was talking about putting things into a community trust, moving more nurses and therapists to work in the community, in primary care settings and so on. And the local authority was thinking about working with communities and with third sector organisations, and it took them a while to realise that this thing that they were nodding in agreement on, they were actually quite a way apart, and they were going to have to spend even longer through their STP process trying to get to some sense of what they actually agreed on. So, and prevention, as I said, is relatively new to social care, so that's another one that people will say, oh, prevention, yes. And we know, particularly in public health, there's models of prevention, but actually they're not at this point concepts that are joined up across the NHS, public health and local authorities. One area I think good news is research ethics is aligned with the NHS. So the HRA is the vehicle for getting research ethics approval if you need it for the social care study, and there's the Social Care Research Ethics Committee. So that's good news. The bad news is, in terms of research governance, we're back to 152 local authorities all doing their own thing, even if some of them actually bother to do anything, if they've got anyone around who actually signs off on research governance. Navigating research governance is absolute minefield.
Do you still have to go through ADAS as well?
Yep. Yeah, So I'll just, the question was, do you have to apply through ADAS if you're working across more than 3 or 4 sites, is it? So ADAS is the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, and they have this role of scrutinising and signing off research proposals for research governance if you're working across a number of local authorities. And they charge a fee for doing that, dependent on the funding for the project. And yes, technically you are still supposed to do it. You fill in for it. It's a relatively straightforward process, I think. And the idea was that this would kind of be a bit of a foot in the door with local authorities, you could say. It's been signed off by ADAS. They've said it's a worthwhile project to support. So please just sign up to supporting this project. But I'm not sure that it works in that way any longer, just because local authorities, are so pressured and aren't even thinking as ADAS sign this off and do I want to participate in this project. But technically, yes, you still have to do it. I've mentioned about this gap between research and practice and the lack of clinical academics. And there's a different culture and expectations around evidence in social care, particularly if you're used to research in the NHS. So I think there is still a sense of, in part of social care, that research is the thing that you turn to when you've got a problem and you're trying to find the answer. So I'm struggling with this group of people. I'm going to look at what evidence is out there. And if something's got a label of research and it says do it in this way, then that's what we're going to do. Rather than, I think, you shouldn't look to individual research projects necessarily to give you the answer. We know it's more about a bigger body of knowledge. And there needs to be an engagement with research over a period of time to understand what's that body of knowledge telling us about this topic, this group of people, and perhaps subsets of that group of people and how we might support them in slightly different ways. And so it's not necessarily about trying to find the one study that gives you the silver bullet to solve the problem that you're firefighting at the moment. So you all know that, you're researchers, but not everyone in social care seems to understand that. They still think in terms of, I want to find the paper that's a silver bullet that means I can sign this off and get it off my desk tomorrow. Higher education institutions, I think, generally the way I'd characterise social care research is that it's one or a small number of people working in a department, and they do the research, they have an interest in it, but the rest of the department perhaps is not so interested. The institution is not so supportive. And often they're juggling that alongside so many other things, particularly teaching. Compared to, say, in a medical school that would have huge amounts of resources through different funding streams of NIHR, for instance, clerks and so on, to then really support people in their research interests and pursue a longer-term perspective about researching topics, research programs, and their research careers. And I think often higher education institutions around social care are more about, okay, you can do that bit on the side if you want to, and we'll make a note in your annual appraisal. But really, we want to make sure that that's not done at the expense of all this other stuff that we need doing. So there's not so much experience around thinking in terms of large, interdisciplinary, multi-university research projects in adult social care. And I think particularly looking at some of the funding streams in NIHR, that's the kind of thing that they want. They're interested in larger scale studies that have within it a coherent, multiple perspective on that issue. Is it effective? Is it cost effective? Those kinds of questions, perhaps all within the one program. And I'm not sure that people in social care research just automatically think in that way. That's what I need to do to put in an application. But I think this is where, for instance, the RDSs can be really well placed to help you think about what do I need to put into a good application for each part of NIHR, because they all look for slightly different things, of course. There are major funders in social care research. thinking in terms of overlapping areas with healthcare, care homes, and the physical health of people in care homes, for instance, has been a fruitful area. Dementia has been a fruitful area. Mental health. So thinking about the health and social care aspects of these can be helpful. But I did mention earlier that social care is a different world, it has a different perspective on things. And that use of the kind of overlapping areas of interest between health and social care shouldn't be done at the expense of making social care researchers that are part of that project feel like they're really tokenistic and not really being listened to, and that their view of the world is not really contributing to the research proposal. And there are huge challenges for impact. You know, how do you have impact across 152 local authorities, within each local authority, multiple care home providers, multiple providers of daycare or home care, and you know, that just how on earth do you have impact across a sector that's that diverse and diffuse? But that's a topic for another afternoon. Some research questions. How are we doing for time? There's no clock. 10 minutes. Wow. So some research. There's lots of questions around how effective are current ways of working, current services and models. There's huge questions around how are new responsibilities like well-being and new areas being addressed. And then there's this huge area that's vexing social care at the moment. What are the new models of social care? So they're interested, they want to know what are new models to help work with communities, to help to support these young people with disabilities to move into adulthood and have better quality of lives. They want to know all this, but the challenge is, how do you innovate? How do you implement those kind of new models in times of austerity when all your resources are consumed with just coping and firefighting at the moment? Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, hi. I was just going to ask about whether we're looking at other countries for best practice and ideas. Like you say, you know, maybe we're very used to with the NHS being very organised compared to a lot of countries where social care is such a different model. So are we encouraging research into what's happening in other countries? Or
yes, there's a long history of looking at approaches to social care in other countries, and of course the States, and models like case management and so on were drawn from there. But probably even more so than healthcare, social care systems are so different across the world, and it's really difficult to just lift a model from one country to another one. And so people do look, and there's models. Something of Dawn Brooker at Worcester, whose interests are around dementia, and she's currently looking at a model of a kind of community resource hub for people with dementia that was developed in the Netherlands, and she's running a pilot of it with a local authority over here and evaluating it. So people do it, but you really have to be very finely attuned to the different systems of social care and the implications that has for transfer of the model. But yeah, it's something worth doing.
Sorry, in relation to the idea of models of social care, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, obviously we're sitting here all going, oh my God, this is terrible. So, I mean, is this much more about models of financing social care? Shouldn't that be where all our priorities are going for social care, so we can actually finance this? Because what if you're just basing research on available state-funded social care, you're really just tinkering with what is essentially a diminishing safety net, aren't you? So, I mean, it's got to be greater than that, hasn't it? And it has to be to do with financing social care.
Yeah, there's lots of work being done and is being done about state funding, models of state funding of social care, and then DILNOT was the big report a couple of years ago, but there's continuing work around that. And I think we need to look at state funded at the moment, because to just sort of give up on state funding and withdraw it from the sector would actually have huge implications for those parts of the sector that are still people access through self-funding. So as I say, what you might see with care homes is that prices rapidly rise, or you might find that a care home that has largely existed on the basis of state funding suddenly does not exist. So if we are going to, there's this idea of residualisation, where a sector like social housing just becomes seen as a residual that's only there as a bare minimum safety net. If we do go down that route with social care, then it ought to be very carefully planned. Otherwise, there is a risk of completely destabilising in those parts of the sector that aren't obviously state-funded. Then in terms of, self-funders and how they navigate the system, there is interest in that now. Local authorities are starting to pay more of an interest in it, and researchers are as well. But we're still at the early days of just learning about who these people are, what they do, how they navigate the system, how you get, from a research point of view, how you identify them and get access to them. But yes, there's more interest in that group now. So it's difficult. There's a willingness to look at new ways of working, new models, but there is a challenge around trying to find some flexibility of funding. And I mentioned the guy in Nottingham that has a really interesting model that he wants to research, but he can't find anybody to fund that service. And then there's another challenge around how to get evidence about particularly new models, new approaches to the front line quickly in useful ways, rather than researchers always saying, well, we'll give you an answer as to whether that's effective in 3 years' time. In 3 years' time, they might not exist, the service might not exist. So that there's some challenges around that. It is a challenging environment for research. I mentioned resources, but there's less of a research culture across most of social care, so that can make it difficult to get access even at the best of times. There is a huge need to develop research capacity in social care. I mean, you've covered the South East here. Is it South East? South Central, sorry. And, this is the group of academics that have self-identified as being interested in social care research. I'm sure there are some more, but across the whole sector, you are the capacity at the moment. So we're going to protect you and make sure that you're all nurtured. Don't worry. And I've mentioned about the lack of a practitioner academic model. I'm going to skip over that one. So I'm going to move on now to NIHR and social care research interests. How well have NIHR and social care research been aligned in the past? I think generally it's probably been a game of subterfuge by people interested in social care issues, by playing on overlapping areas of interests. If you can identify topics like delayed transfers of care or care of older people in care homes, and particularly where you can argue that that you're going to prevent admissions to hospital. So I think people have often used those kind of perspectives and arguments as a way of supporting research in social care settings, but saying that it's really about how it might have benefits for the NHS. That's not necessarily fully playing up to the ethos of social care, but that has been a way I think that people have navigated trying to get funding through NIHR, and looking at shared interests with public health, and when those topical issues like integration come up. But I think often people in social care have been put off by the word health in NIHR, and probably haven't really been in a place to think through how might I access all of the huge resources, not just the individual funding streams for research projects, but the advice and support of RDSs, for instance. How can I access all those huge resources in the NIHR? And then the NIHR is not necessarily the easiest beast to navigate from the outside at first. So please don't be put off by the word health. So in the past, I think it's been this kind of game of if you don't ask, we won't tell you what we're doing. But there is more interest now in the NIHR in social care in its own right, and Chris Whitty has said, we need to support social care research. We need to develop capacity there. Social care has been in some calls, but it hasn't always been very obvious or visible. So, for instance, the NIHR fellowship programs, they say in their long documentation somewhere, and social care research. But then the rest of the document just kind of doesn't really emphasise that and play up to it. But yeah, the fellowships are open. Some of the fellowship schemes are open to people from social care to apply. It's just not always been obvious. I think one of the things with NIHR is it's starting to think about how it can develop a commissioning infrastructure to support commissioning more social care research, by which I mean largely things like reviewers and panel members. So the funding applications that you might put in through NIHR will go to commissioning panels after going through reviewers. Now, if there aren't the social care reviewers to fairly judge that application, the risk is that it doesn't get good reviews. And if things don't get good reviews, by the time they get to the panel, they've got no chance. Even if you get a good review, the panel may not quite understand some of the aspects of the project. And again, it might not be funded in comparison to a proposal that the panel really understand much better. So one bit of advice or plea really to you as social care researchers is to look to put yourself forward as reviewers for parts of NIHR funding streams. So they don't know you're there, and how are they going to find you? I think you need to. I think most of the funding streams you register with them to say I'm available to be a reviewer and here's my research interests. Do that, and then if you all do it, then when you're individually putting in your research applications, you've got more chance of being heard by sympathetic reviewers. And then each of the funding streams will put out calls for people to sign up to go on their commissioning panels. And again, do consider applying for that. It's quite a bit of work sitting on panels. It can be really interesting, though, reading other people's research proposals and what reviewers have made of it. So it can be quite a good learning opportunity, but it is quite a bit of work. I appreciate that. But do consider signing up. And I think NIHR is more interested in social care research, but I think we need to make sure that social care research is well placed to make the most of those opportunities. What can you and your institutions do to make sure that you and colleagues are well placed to make the most of this new interest in social care? And capacity development is an ongoing issue. I should say I'm going to acknowledge that NIHR has funded social care research. It might not have always realised that it's funded it, as I said earlier. But these were just a few things that came to my mind as I was putting together the presentation. So cognitive stimulation therapy for people with dementia, being delivered in people's homes, in care homes, probably more so than in the NHS. So it was funded. It's a guy called Martin Orrell, who's a medic, who's the PI behind a lot of the cognitive stimulation therapy research. But it's largely about an intervention to be delivered in social care. The SHIELD programme, which was about psychosocial interventions for people with dementia living at home. And again, another project that was kind of framed as a health perspective on the issue, but it was really about delivering something in people's homes in a social care environment. Balance of care in old age mental health services, David Chalice and colleagues based at Manchester and others. They looked at this notion of what is the right balance of resources to have in your old age mental health system, particularly between community resources and inpatient resources, and how do you decide how to organise that balance to make the best use of it. So that's an interesting combination of NHS and social care settings and issues. Medical care in care homes often comes up as a topic. How do you deliver? I think the situation is generally people in care homes while they're resident in the homes, use fewer resources of the NHS than similar people in the general population of similar age. That's not necessarily because they're great and they're better looked after. It may well be because they're being neglected for those physical health needs. So the sense is there's been various research looking at how can you improve medical care and medical cover in care homes. So again, those interfaces of the NHS and social care. And then life story work is a way of working with people with dementia to map out their experiences and document them, so that you get to understand the person better, but so that you've also got points of contact during the care processes, and you can sit and talk to people about their lives and reminisce. So it has funded, that's just a few examples, it has funded quite a lot of research that's of interest to social care. It may not have been just so obvious that it was of interest to social care. And the NIHR has funded some infrastructure to support social care research. I mentioned NRICH, which is a network to support care homes to be ready to participate in research, and there's a toolkit and the website and the network. So if you're interested in research in care homes, that's a place to look for potentially recruiting homes to be part of your project. Joint dementia research, where people can sign up and say that they're willing to support dementia research. You probably know about Involve, that supports patient and public involvement in research, but a lot of the resources there are just about addressing similar issues in social care research as well. And of course the RDS and their growing interest in supporting colleagues like yourselves to think about accessing NIHR funding for social care research. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 things that I could think of. I was struggling to think of much more after that. But NIHR has put some support in and is thinking about what further support might need to go into support improving social care research. In developing capacity is one of the areas that they're thinking about. And so potentially looking at finding ways of making more fellowships available to people in social care research. But I should say that NIHR has funded a few fellowships. I could say these were the only 4 that I could think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there are 1 or 2 more, but there aren't many people from a social care perspective that have had access to NIHR fellowships. If you don't know about the fellowship programs, go and have a look, because they are fantastic opportunities. The resources there are huge to pay for people's time, other training and support, to do projects, to get doctorates and so on. They're fantastic opportunities, but again, it's not always obvious that they're open to people from social care research. But NIHR is looking to how it can promote that kind of opportunity more to people in social care research. But again, as I said earlier, I think it's partly about then how can we make sure that the world of social care research is prepared to make the most of these opportunities as they come up? Because I think it would be a terrible waste if we're then putting in not very good applications when these opportunities open up. So I think colleagues at the RDS would be a great resource to talk to make sure that we're getting in really good high quality applications when the opportunities come out. So there's our details, and I've bunged on the disclaimer to say everything I've said is my view and not necessarily those of the Department of Health or the NIHR. I just thought, as it's been videoed, I better cover myself. So, okay. Sorry I went on for so long, but I hope you found that interesting and useful.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We've got 15 minutes before I start talking. So we need time to go and get some food, go to the toilet. But I don't know whether any burning couple of questions that anyone has. Are you happy to answer questions by email?
Yeah, do. My email's on the first slide, so please do email me directly. And then there's the details there for the school as well.
Does anyone want to ask anything now? We've got 1-2 questions maximum.
Sorry, it's just a very basic question.
Your mouse.
Right, okay. I just want to know about what's the length of the application process. So from beginning, if it's successful, to the time point of contracting. And also, while you keeping focusing on social care is very different from NHS. My next question is, what kind of what kind of applications would be more attractive? Are you specifically looking on social care focused research proposal, or you are also welcome the multidisciplinary research proposal to address some issue regard to social care?
Okay. Well, I think the answer to both questions is it depends. It always is. I think in part it depends on the particular funding stream that you're applying to. So if you're applying for a large NIHR program grant for 5 years and £2 million plus, you know, it might take you maybe a year to get a good application together, and then it might take best part of another year for it to go through review and panel and contracting and so on. I think a year for that kind of process. So it might be, from you first thinking about the proposal, it might be 2 years before you start the project. Obviously, for more modest sums of funding, it could be quite a bit shorter. But I think, for instance, the fellowships, what we're hearing is that colleagues in healthcare are thinking at least a year in advance of their application for a fellowship, and spending that year working on making sure that they and their application are as strong as possible, so that they're in a good place to compete to get the fellowship award. So I think even with the more modest, I mean, the fellowships are fantastic, but compared to a program grant, they're quite modest. Even applying for something that was more modest in NIHR terms, people are looking maybe a year in advance to work up the ideas and the application. And I forgot what the second part was, sorry.
Yeah, the presentation has been focusing on social care. Just wonder what kind of nature of a research project will be more attractive in terms of a social care focus, or you still welcome multidisciplinary research project?
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think, again, it depends on the funding stream and what their interests are. And I think in the past, people have tended to do a bit more of this is largely about health and a bit of social care. Now NIHR is getting more interested in social care in its own right, so putting in applications that are more squarely about social care is a good thing to start to move towards doing, I think. But that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be only social workers, for instance, that are involved in the proposal. You could still, and you would still expect to see the right range of methodological expertise and other expertise appropriate for the research question that you're proposing to address. So I think you could still be saying we're doing social care research and then applying multidisciplinary perspectives to answer the question, which may include qualitative research and statisticians and economists all working within the same project.
Okay, thank you. Mike, since you're around, you could perhaps at the end of my talk, there'll be probably time for questions, so people can ask further questions of him then.